All right, good morning all and welcome to our June edition of Plants, Pests and Pathogens. We have something very timely today to talk about, and that is tomatoes and the pests and diseases of tomatoes that we encounter and the public that we answer questions for always encounters, but also with an eye to some of our cultivars that are now more resistant to these diseases and pests. So we look forward to that presentation in just a few minutes from Matt and Mike. And today, Charlotte's Plant These Instead is also tied right in with plant tomato cultivars that are resistant to some of the diseases that we're going to talk about today. I do have an announcement that I want to put right up front this morning, and that is soon it's time for the fun Plants, Pests, and Pathogens that we do every year in August. And this is the one where you can submit images of plant issues, pests, symptoms that you see in your garden or maybe in the community garden that you manage. We want you to submit these photos, and we've got the submission form ready now. So you can start taking your pictures and uploading them through July. And it will be the August edition of Plants, Pests, and Pathogens when Matt and Mike will answer the questions and curate those photos and present to us what they're seeing. So it's a great session. And once you receive the follow-up email from today, you will have the link to the photo submission form. So we do ask that you submit one form for each problem or issue. That keeps it nice and clean for us so we know the photos go with that particular issue that you're asking about. It is important to know, though, that to submit photos using the Google form, you have to have a Google account. So a Gmail address, you might have that. That means you have a Google account, or you can simply have a Google account to use these features. There's also information here to help you get a Google account if you don't have one, which is free and very easy to sign up for. But you've got to have that in order to be able to use our Google Drive, which is where we're putting the photos. So that's just one little caveat about using our form. This is the same situation that we had last year, if you're familiar with that. So we look forward to collecting those and talking about those issues in the August edition of Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. So with that, I will introduce Matt and Mike, who will talk to us today about pests and diseases of tomatoes. Matt, will you be going first?
Sure, I think so. Mike, is that good?
Yep, let's do it that way so that then Charlotte can segue into the Plant These Instead from the diseases.
Yeah, of course.
Excellent.
Okay. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Thanks everyone for attending today. And I'm going to, of course, be talking to you about arthropods, or the little critters that feed on tomatoes. Now, despite, of course, toxins in tomato plants, the solanaceous crops have a lot of alkaloids that are poisonous. In fact, the actual plant itself, other than the fruit, can make you sick. Despite these toxins, there are several groups of arthropods that feed on tomatoes. The chewing and sucking pests are the most common, and root pests are very minor on tomatoes, and there are also slug and snail pests, but I'm not actually going to cover those for time's sake. So these arthropods may feed on the foliage of fruits. As you see here, a tomato fruit worm doing what it's supposed to do, apparently, by its name, boring into fruits. Some transmit diseases, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in detail. And there's really no resistant varieties for pests. So that'll be important when Charlotte is talking about the resistant varieties will be more for diseases than for actual insect pests. Although I read very briefly online that there may be some that could be resistant to whiteflies, but they're not really available. So I'm going to start off with lepidopteran, or caterpillar pests of tomatoes. The most famous one is probably the hornworms. So these are larvae of sphinx moths. The two species that are often associated with tomatoes are Manduca sexta and Manduca quincamaculatus. Manduca sexta being the tobacco hornworm and quincamaculatus being the tomato hornworm. The larvae are medium to large and voracious caterpillars, and they are characterized by this hook-like horn on the tip of their abdomen. Now, I should note that there are some other groups of moths and butterflies that have larvae with a hook-like horn, but they're not going to be really found on tomatoes. So these are going to be the most common species you'll find there. After they're done feeding, they crawl to the ground and pupate and form this kind of very large pupa, reddish brown pupa with this long kind of nose where the proboscis is developing. And the adults of these large nocturnal moths, which I'll show you in a second. So the larvae may defoliate plants, but typically don't destroy plants. They're not usually present in super high numbers, but can be a pest, of course, feeding on some of the foliage. Now, the two main species I mentioned are the tobacco hornworm and the tomato hornworm. They differ a little bit they're superficially very similar, but they differ in a couple of key characters. Like I said, tobacco hornworm is the most common on tomatoes, ironically, and it has 7 stripes on it versus the 7 V shapes on tomato hornworm. Also, the tobacco hornworm's horn is usually a reddish yellow-orange color, whereas in tomato hornworm, it's typically a dark color. So this is how you get to tell the difference. But I would say, like I said, most commonly, you're going to get tobacco hornworm on your garden tomatoes. Now, the adults are night-flying, very large moths that are actually pollinators. You can see this one extending its proboscis into a flower. So they can be important. And they are very beautiful moths, but again, the larvae are feeding on your tomatoes probably. So, quick quiz. Everybody's seen this, but what is it? Probably everybody's seen it. A lot of people have. So what are these white structures on a hornworm? And I will start a poll now. And feel free to answer, and we'll see what you think. Feel like I have to clarify this just for people, just so people know specifically. It's very common to see hornworms with this. We have some in the chat. Okay, somebody's saying B in the chat. Okay, we are going to give it another 10 seconds, let's just say. Okay. All right, I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so here's the results. Can everyone see that? I'm hoping. So we have, let's see. So a lot of people said B, and then the next most was C, and then A, D, and E. So I asked this because it is sometimes confused for what it can be confusing what these are, and I'm actually going to end that poll. But these are actually the cocoons of a parasite. So what happens is the eggs were laid in the larva when it was younger, and there's a small wasp that does that. And basically, those wasp larvae then live inside the caterpillar. And when they're about to become adults, they bore outside of the caterpillar in a gruesome way. That's what all these holes are for. And the larvae of the wasps then start to spin a silken cocoon in which the adults develop. So if you see a caterpillar like this, it's usually going to be not completely dead, but it's bad off and it's going to die. You can just put it in your garden somewhere on the ground. It's not going to be feeding much more. And all those wasps that emerge from these cocoons are going to mate and lay eggs in more hornworms and some other caterpillars. So they are effective biocontrol, although not as rapid as some people would like. Okay, moving on to some tiny caterpillars are pinworms, tomato pinworms. So these are Gelichiid moths. Gelichiids are pretty characteristically known for their palps that curve over their head. And they have very small caterpillars. These are only about a quarter of an inch or so at most in size when they're full grown, the larvae. The larvae start by mining in leaves, and I'll show you that in a second, and they create blotches. And as they grow, they leave the mine and then tie the leaves with silk to feed inside. They may even bore into the stems and fruit. The moths are very small and nondescript. I don't know how often you'd actually see them around, but they are only, about a quarter, third of an inch long, very tiny. Generally sporadic, but can be damaging. And here's just a caterpillar, one of the caterpillars next to its mines. So they create these mines, these large blotch-like mines. And if you rip them open, you'll find this little hairy caterpillar with these mottled colorations. And actually what I noticed about them too is they got this stripe on the face. Okay, some other caterpillars, fruit worms and budworms. So the tomato fruit worm, also called the cornea worm or bollworm, Helica verpacea, and the tobacco budworm, Chloridia virescens, are both very common on tomatoes. They're generalist caterpillars and feed on the leaves and fruit. The fruit damage is the most important. As you saw in that first slide, they can bore right into the fruit and feed on them. The plant that you want, the plant part that you want. They are striped with prominent warts, usually dark warts on them. And then when you look up close under a microscope, you see their body is like sandpaper. So it's covered with these little tiny spicules. The adults are medium-sized drab moths. I could show pictures, but it's tough to catch them sometimes in the act. You most often see the larvae. I should mention that the larvae come in different colors, from pink to green to brown, and that can even change the colors within the same individual over its lifetime. Similar group of caterpillars are called the armyworms. These are in the genus Spodoptera, and on tomatoes, it's most often going to be southern and yellow striped armyworms. These are small to medium caterpillars with stripes and dark spots, especially these very large, almost velvety dark black spots. The species that affect tomatoes often have this yellow, orange, or red head. And Spodoptera typically are identified by inverted yellow Y on the head, although these individuals don't really show it. The adults, not the adults, the more mature larvae often show it a little bit more than the younger larvae. They're usually not a severe pest. They're foliage feeders, and I often find them on my tomatoes when you see frass or the fecal pellets landing on leaves below. So you can search around for them, and you might find these striped these armyworms, different types of armyworms. Okay, now on to some coleopteran or beetle pests of tomatoes. So flea beetles can be an important pest, especially of very young plants. As the plants get older and more mature, they're typically not as much of a problem. But these are in the leaf beetle family Chrysomelidae, and the main genus is Epitrix. This genus actually contains a lot of species that feed on solanaceous plants. In fact, here's the eggplant flea beetle and the tobacco flea beetle, which will all feed on other solanaceous crops like tomatoes. They're small black or brown beetles that can jump with these enlarged hind legs. You can see their hind legs look kind of like a flea's legs. The larvae are in soil and rarely seen, but the adults cause this shot hole damage in plants where they chew little holes all over, and it looks like somebody kind of shot a bunch of pellets through the leaf, and you see all this kind of see-through like Swiss cheese. Like I said, many species prefer solanaceous plants, and because there's solanaceous weeds like horse nettle and things like that, that will feed on those as well. But they're really, like I said, only serious on seedlings. So when the plants are more mature, they're typically able to withstand the feeding, and the feeding doesn't cause a reduction in the amount of fruit that's produced. Now, another leaf beetle, though very different, much bigger and doesn't jump, very large beetle called the Colorado potato beetle. This is a major pest of solanaceous crops, and it's actually native to western U.S. Out in Colorado and the Rockies and places like that, and has since moved to different areas of the U.S. and different parts of the world. In fact, it could be a serious pest in Europe, one that we exported to them. Both the adults and the larvae feed on leaves. And the larvae are like rotund red caterpillars. I'll show you that in a second. The adults are shiny, round, and with these very distinct stripes. So they have an orange head and pronotum with these black spots, and then they have these very bold, dark brown stripes interspersed with these cream color stripes. They do lay clusters of tall yellow eggs on leaves, which can be mistaken for ladybug eggs, but typically they lay more and they're more densely packed than in ladybug eggs. So here's another shot of the adult, the eggs that they lay on the leaf surface, and the larvae. The larvae can get even much more round than this one. This one maybe a little bit less fed. They get very, very round and shiny, but they're this reddish color. And note too, though, that there's a similar one, another native one called the false potato beetle. This one I took, both these photos I took a few months ago down in southern Georgia, where there was a lot of horse nettle. And this is actually a live adult. It's just playing dead. Unfortunately, I didn't get a good photo of it acting naturally, although this is pretty natural for it. These typically feed on horse nettles, but the larvae are cream colored white with a single row of spots, compared to, say, the Colorado potato beetle larvae, which are red with these couple rows of spots. Also, the adults are distinct from Colorado potato beetles in that these side stripes have a darker brown stripe in the middle, whereas in the regular Colorado potato beetle, that it doesn't exist there. Okay, another group of beetles that will feed on tomatoes are the blister beetles. These are in the family Meloidae. The adults are the damaging stage. The adults have these leathery front wings, these elytra, which are usually hardened and shiny in many beetles, are more leathery and elongate. They have this thin neck and this very bulbous big head and long legs. And their tarsal formula, which I don't talk about a lot, which is the number of tarsal segments, basically segments in the feet of these beetles, is the same as kind of darkwing beetles and the other groups that they're related to, in that they have 5 segments here, 5 segments here, and 4 segments here. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. They do feed on a variety of plants, so we'll defoliate weeds and crops that you like. The larvae are interesting in that they parasitize grasshopper eggs or bee nests, so they can be detrimental sometimes or beneficial depending on when they're larvae. But as adults, they are foliage feeders and flower feeders, and so they can be damaging to plants. Another issue with these beetles to be aware of is that adults bleed cantharidin, which is a chemical that causes blisters. So that's why they have that name. They bleed out their joints, this oil, and if it gets on your skin, it can actually cause blistering. But they're not dangerous otherwise and can be observed from a safe distance. Okay, let's see, next one. So next group are the Hemiptera, the true bugs. These are all going to be sucking insects. They have long sucking mouth parts, and so do not cause chewing damage or don't actually remove tissue from the plants. They just suck the juices from the plants. So the first group are the garden flea hoppers. They're in the family Miridae, which is the group of plant bugs, and their species is Microtechnites bractatus. So the eggs are laid in plant tissue and are very small, and the nymphs are green, and I'll show you both these in a second. The adults are small, black, with some white scales on them, and they're similar in appearance to flea beetles, except they have fewer antennal segments, only 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and have sucking mouth parts, which is a little difficult to see here. All of the free living stages feed on various plants, and as the name implies, they can jump. So these are very common in gardens, feed on weeds and garden plants. And so the eggs are very, very tiny. These are the trichomes of the plant. So you can see they're very tiny and they're inserted into the tissue. And when they hatch and get a little bit older, these are the young of the garden flea hopper, and they're actually green rather than black like the adults. The adults come in a couple of forms. Females can either be long-winged or this short-winged form that actually makes it look even more like a beetle. And males always have this long-winged form, although some females are long-winged. Now, the damage is pretty characteristic not because of these little white stippling marks on the plant, which is common to leaf hoppers and a couple other sucking pests. But in addition to these white spots, these stippling, they leave these really shiny black fecal specks on there. They're a little tough to see here, but they're kind of these little dark black fecal specks. And they are a little bit 3-dimensional, look like little hardened bits of kind of material on the surface. Okay, another sucking insect that can affect tomatoes are stink bugs in the family Pentatomidae. These are medium-sized shield-shaped bugs. Many people are familiar with them, of course, especially this one, the brown marmorated stink bug that invades homes at certain times of year. Many feed on plants, but note that there's some are predators. And I'm sure I've talked about the difference before in plants, pests, pathogens. I'm not going to go over them specifically right now, but there are some beneficial predatory stink bugs. So just be aware of the species that might be feeding on caterpillars and other things on your plants rather than the plants themselves. The plant feeders damage tomatoes by feeding on the fruit. Typically, we don't see them feeding on much on the stems or the leaves of the plant, but they do enjoy feeding on the fruits. This feeding causes large star-like spots on the fruit, and the flesh is corky underneath. So it sucks. They suck the color out. There's corkiness to the flesh of the fruit, which makes it, you know, not very nice to eat. Leaf-footed bugs, which I'm not going to show, can cause similar damage to fruits. And just to show you, here's some, a couple green stink bugs and a brown stink bug. That's actually their names. But I couldn't find any good photos, and I don't have any good photos of the damage on tomatoes. But basically, just imagine these are red, round fruit. You're going to be looking at basically the same thing on tomatoes, where they create these large star-like, almost looks like an explosion or a burst on the flesh of the fruit, and that's from them inserting their stylets and sucking out the juices, which makes this tissue collapse and become corky and all that. Aphids are very common sucking insect on tomatoes as well, and the most common species are going to be green peach aphid and potato aphids. Now, although they may be common, they rarely do significant damage unless in very large numbers, in which case they can cause leaf distortion, but we very rarely see this. Small populations of aphids are not going to be a huge issue on tomatoes, and natural predators and parasites often take them out with no problem. One of the issues with them, though, can be that they can transmit viruses, for example, potaviruses. And so these will obviously affect the plant, and it's the way they're vectored. So if an aphid picks up this virus and transmits it to a new plant, it may infect that plant. Okay, another group of sucking insects are the whiteflies. There are many species. The main species that affect tomatoes are going to be greenhouse whitefly, which I dare anyone to pronounce that name, and the silverleaf whitefly, Bemisia tabaci. I will pronounce his name as Trialurodes vaporariorum, which is a mouthful. The adults are tiny white fly-like insects seen here, and the adults are very difficult to identify, but the resting pupal stage is the most diagnostic. So these can cause chlorosis and leaf drop in high densities, and they do produce honeydew that can encourage sooty mold growth. Furthermore, Bemisia transmits tomato yellow leaf curl virus, which we're actually seeing a good bit of lately. The leaves of the tomatoes are stunted, their edges curl up, and they get very, very gnarly looking and yellow in color. So this is an important virus and an important vector of the virus. Now, let's see. Like I said, the pupae are the ones that are the stage that's most diagnostic. So the silverleaf whitefly pupae here are kind of pillow-like with or without numerous setae. In fact, depending on the host plant, they'll develop setae or not, but they always have a pair of setae near the tip of the abdomen. And another really common species is the greenhouse whitefly. This is a chlorotic leaf showing lots and lots of specimens on there, lots and lots of these pupae. So even if you don't see the adults flying around, you may find these pupae. And the pupae of greenhouse whiteflies are pretty three-dimensional, raised up off the surface, and they have this very distinct crown of setae all around the body. They don't have setae typically on the body, a few maybe, but mostly they're going to have these numerous setae around the body. Okay, a couple other pests of tomatoes, and then we'll get into some mite pests. So thrips. So thrips are common on they're commonly flower thrips are the most common ones that are affecting tomatoes in the genus Franklinella, especially the western flower thrips, Franklinella occidentalis. They're very small, long, often yellow insects with strap-like fringed wings. You can see here, but these insects are only a couple millimeters long, so it's going to be difficult to see this like this normally. They pierce and suck plant juices, causing silvering and sometimes distortion of the leaves. And of course, probably the most important issue with thrips and tomatoes is that they vector tomato spotted wilt virus, which especially this year is very common in especially solanaceous plants, but is found in lots of different plants. In fact, we got in some fruit from an infected plant that had all these very distinct rings on them and these depressions. The fruit was really gnarly and unmarketable. It was hard to find actual damage on tomatoes, but typically thrips damage, you may find the larvae, these little wingless ones, crawling around. But on a potato, here's some thrips damage, just localized in the central vein, but they can be all over. And again, they feed on the contents of the tissue. It takes the green out. You get the silvery or white patches, and they're very messy. They leave dark fecal spots all over. So you can see from a distance, it's all speckly. That's actually the feces of the thrips. So in this case, you'd want to look very close with the hand lens and look for the larvae, especially because they're going to be present usually in high numbers if they're present. Another pest of the leaves are the leaf miner flies. These are fairly minor, no pun intended, fly pest. And these are very small flies, black and yellow. And the females lay an egg in the leaf. And we know where it started because it's the tiniest part of the mine. So this one laid an egg right here. And it's a very tiny maggot, started out very tiny. And as it grew, the mine gets bigger and bigger. And it creates these serpentine mines that can become blotch-like. In high densities, it can cause leaf drop on the plants, but it's rarely a very important pest in home gardens. And low densities really only cause cosmetic damage. But if you see a lot of these, it may be time to control. I did read that if they're very often parasitized by other things, so sometimes if you use broad spectrum pesticides in an area, it can kill the parasites that eat these things. Okay, finally, a few mites, pests of tomatoes. Now, mites are arachnids, which means when they're full grown, for the most part, they're going to have 8 legs, although one of the ones I show you doesn't. One of the few groups of arachnids that feed on plants. So tomatoes are host to a few different mite species. The most specific is the tomato russet mite. Tomato russet mite is an areophyid mite. These are long, thin, worm-like mites with only 4 legs in the front. But since they're only about 1/4 millimeter long and, like I said, very tiny, most people will never see the individual mites up close to see those legs. They're so tiny that the colonies on the plant look like dust. So it can be mistaken for rust spores or some kind of dusting on them. And that's because these mites, like I said, are very, very tiny. This species attacks tomatoes specifically, and it works its way up from the bottom of the plant, and it can cause bronzing, greasy look, curled leaves, and rusting and cracking of the fruit when they're in high densities. This mite is typically not a pest of home tomato gardens. I most often see it in greenhouses, but just note that it can exist, and it looks like this dusting. And actually, if you want to see what it looks like a little bit up close, it's these thousands and thousands and thousands of little, almost like ice cream cone or worm-like mites. You can actually see the 4 legs on this mite right here. When they get in really high densities, they stand on the tip of their abdomen and wave and wait for the wind to blow them to other plants. And you can see them up close here. They look like just these worm-like critters. Now, common pest of a lot of plants, including tomatoes, are going to be spider mites. Typically, 2-spotted spider mite is the most common. Very small, pale to green mites, often with these 2 spots. They do produce silk and webbing, sometimes a lot, and small, pale, round eggs. And the feeding, again, there's sucking type arthropod. The feeding on the leaf tissue causes stippling and chlorotic areas on the leaves. In high densities, in certain conditions, especially dry conditions, they can create a lot of webbing everywhere. And you can see the stippling on a plant. So it causes all these little white spots where they've sucked the color out. You can see the theme here with a lot of these sucking arthropods. And the eggs are small, pale, smooth globules, basically like spheres. And finally, broad mites. So broad mites are in the family Tarsinimidae, another scientific name to challenge people with. These are very small mites, very, very small, about the size of Areophytes, maybe a little bit bigger. Both of those mites are much smaller than a spider mite. These are difficult to see even with a hand lens, but if you can see them up close, you may see these fast moving females that are football shaped with a stripe down their back. And really the eggs are the most distinct part. When I see plants come in with even just the egg shells, I'm able to tell very quickly that there are broad mites present. They have these ovoid eggs that have these bumps all over them, these very regularly spaced bumps. Now they feed on the new growth, and what happens is the saliva causes the new growth to distort and get strappy and crinkled. And this could be similar to some virus symptoms and herbicides. So it's always good to check for these broad mites, just in case, because obviously that's a biological pest, not a herbicide issue or something like that. And just to show you what that looks like, here's broad mite damage on tomato leaves. The new growth just gets all strappy and scarred and crinkled. And if you were to look up very close onto these, you would find those broad mites. So that is all I have now until we start with the bolos in a bit. And I saw there were some questions, so I'll try and answer those in the chat while Mike is speaking. And please let me know if you have any other questions.
Thank you, Matt. That is quite the reminder of all the insects who are preying on our tomatoes and solanaceous crops. Oh boy!
And I should mention, I'm gonna post this link in the comments in the chat. This is a very nice. It's kind of a little older, but it's got a nice rundown of a lot of these pests that I'm mentioning, and some of the control, and some of the other, a lot more information I'm presenting. And that's kind of a one-stop page for tomato pests from NC State.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll make sure that that link is in the follow-up resources as well. So looking back, it seems like the first question that came in was about the false potato beetle. Matt, does that actually feed on tomatoes as well as the potato beetle?
Yeah, so that's I got to look that up because it may feed on it. It typically prefers horse nettle, and so I just want to put it out there because you may have horse nettle growing along with tomatoes, and it's a very common weed, horse nettle, around here, and same family as potatoes, eggplant, and peppers and tomatoes. But yeah, a lot of these pests have kind of more specific tastes than others. So I'm going to look that up real quick just to make sure. Okay. But yeah, and then I see, does diatomaceous earth help control flea beetles? I had a lot of damage from them. I don't know that it actually controls the adults. The larvae are going to be very difficult to control because they're in the soil. For flea beetles, I would look up on that page that I linked. That'll have some information on flea beetles. And if you just look up flea beetles and CSU, there are a lot of them that feed on all different crops. And so you'll find a lot of good information on that. And yeah, I don't know if I want to let, we might have Mike go, and maybe I could just type in some of these answers.
That sounds good. Okay.
Great.
Mike, whenever you're ready.
All right. Hello, everyone. I see we have 171 people on this. So this is, I actually am going to comb my hair a little bit and share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see the title here, which was 4 years ago called 10 Years of Tomato Troubles. And I've updated to be 14 years now. I went back and took a look at our data since then. Not a lot has changed, but I want to show you the breakdown. Here are two examples of some tomato problems that we have encountered over the years, but I want to actually start out, and with so many people on the Zoom call, we can't really go on and everyone contribute to this, but I'm going to ask each person who's logged in, or each group of people, if you're sitting there with other Master Gardener volunteers, to come up briefly with what you think are the top 5 tomato problems that we've diagnosed in North Carolina home gardens over the last 14 years. And this is, of course, a biased sample because it's things that have come into the clinic. But what, in your personal experience or professional experience, have been the most common tomato problems in North Carolina home gardens? So I'll give you a moment to think about that and jot those down, just the top 5, and consult with the other folks in the room if you're, again, doing this in a community setting. And we'll somehow pick, I don't know, Caroline, is there a way to sort of randomly pick somebody to answer this, or do we look for
Well,
volunteers?
there's a
Do we
lot
put
coming
people on
into the
spot?
chat that I could see. I see that one of them that's a common theme, Mike, is bottom rot or bottom rot. But I think they might mean blossom end rot by that. Yeah.
Likely they do.
Blossom end rot. So that's a very popular one. Another one is bacterial wilt.
Okay.
And we've got our hornworms. And I'd say would be blight, early and late blight.
Interesting. Okay. All right, we'll give people a minute just so that they have their own list of top 5 to compare to here. And then I'm going to put up the list that we have. So just another few seconds there. You don't necessarily have to put it in the chat. Thank you for doing that, those who did. But just for the exercise, have your list handy to compare to ours, which we'll do in just another few moments. All right. Here then are the top 5 according to the data that we have for the last 14 years. And whoever said bacterial wilt, you are in 100% agreement with us here. We have seen over this period of time almost 90 different diagnoses of southern bacterial wilt on tomato in North Carolina home gardens in that period of time. So that would be our number 1. And number 2 is tomato spotted wilt virus. So that one is one that Matt mentioned, and it's also one that we do see a lot of, not just on tomato, but on other crops as well. Something that didn't get mentioned, but is extremely important and common, is chemical injury, often herbicide injury. So I'll make a few comments about that. Septoria leaf spot and Fusarium wilt are then numbers 4 and 5. Now, just if you think about the averages here, divide any of these numbers by 14 and you get the average number of times that we've seen it. So once you get below 14 on the list here, it means something we're seeing less often than once a year on average on home garden tomatoes in North Carolina. So let us see a little bit about each of these. So first of all, number 1, the bacterial wilt or southern bacterial wilt caused by Ralstonia solanacearum. It is a soil-borne bacterium that will live pretty much indefinitely in the soil once it's there. And I remember Frank Lowe's, back when he was still in our department and had brought in a sample, I think even, he was concerned that he might have it because he says if he had it, then his ground would be ruined for tomatoes. And now, of course, we have, thanks in part to his work, we have something that we can do about this that I'll mention later on in the segment. General wilting, of course, of the plant is something that you will notice. And if you were to cut open the stem in the lower portion, you would see some of this darkening here of the vascular tissue. which is not unique to this particular disease, but this is one of the things that you'll suspect if you see this. And you may even be able to do the home test. You just pull a beaker off the kitchen shelf there and put some water in it, cut the segment of it, and suspend it in that water. And within 30 seconds or so, you should see these milky strands coming down from that cut stem. And that's just the enormous quantities of bacteria that are present in the xylem elements of the tomato. This will work well for tomato or for tobacco, but in some other plants, the streaming you wouldn't necessarily depend on as a reliable indicator. Just a quick comparison though, since we're talking about wilting, and put this into context, there's a lot of different things that can cause wilting in our tomatoes. So high soluble salts would be one. A little bit too heavy fertilization is the usual explanation for that. Southern blight, which I will show a picture of later, it didn't make the top 5, but there what you're looking for is that lesion at the base of the main stem, which under humid conditions can produce actually growth of the fungi that's visible, first as the mycelium, the kind of white mat of fungal threads, and then later the sclerotia forming on there, the small little pills like a bad sweater that develop and become sort of a reddish brown at maturity. It looks a lot like a radish seed in size. And that is something that's typical in the hottest months of the summer. Root knot nematode. So digging up the plant will give you the indication there, and you'll be able to see if you have galls on the root system there. Bacterial wilt, again, that darkened vascular system, the bacterial ooze coming from the cut stem and water. Fusarium wilts, which I'll mention in the number 5 of the top 5, you'll also have those streaks in the vascular system, reddish in color, and you may also clue in on a one-sidedness to it. So just one side of the plant or even one side of a leaf showing the yellowing and the wilting. And this is especially a problem on heirlooms, but we'll talk a little bit about the whole concept of resistance and what's happening with that. Tomato spotted wilt virus, mostly we're thinking about the spotting as the symptom, but you could get some mild wilting from it, and those spots are going to be present even on the youngest leaves. And as Matt made reference to, you can get some spots and rings on the fruit as well. I'll show some photos of both of those. And finally, Pythium root rot, which by causing the decay of the roots, you get the wilting as an effect. And that's usually not a primary problem on tomatoes except in the seedling stage. With that, let's take a quick look at here. Number 2, tomato spotted wilt virus. Both of these pictures are from here in the clinic. The leaf picture from April of 2015, Richmond County. And the fruit picture was in July of the previous year, Sampson County sample. And you'll notice that, well, you can't really tell because I've only shown one leaf, I guess, right? But the spotting will be not just on the lower leaves, but you'll see it on the new growth as well. And that's an important clue that you don't have septoria leaf spot, but that you do have tomato spotted wilt virus, since septoria will not show up on those youngest leaves. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And the reason that it can show up on the young growth is because the virus is systemic in the plant. The spotted fruits there, of course, you can see, and again, Matt already made mention of some of these sort of novelty shaped fruits with the necrotic spots and the ring spots on them. Our number 3 most common was if you take the categories of chemical and herbicide injury and combine those, and there are 3 different ways that can affect our vegetable gardens, right? So there can be either spray drift from an application that you or a neighbor made that was on perhaps it was on a breezy day and some of those spray droplets floated over, or you may have reused a sprayer for a fungicide or an insecticide application that had herbicide in it, and the carryover there was residue in that sprayer that got on your plants. And the final and most pernicious method is that you can get carryover of certain very slow to decompose herbicides in manure or compost that then you bring into your garden and use or incorporate and have the problem then show up as herbicide symptoms. So let's just look quickly at a couple of slides of the two more common types of herbicide injury that we see. One would be the growth regulator or the synthetic auxin herbicides. And these are usually what our clue here is some kind of a distortion. Now note that cucumber mosaic virus can cause a strap-shaped shoestringy type distortion of leaves, but it's very uncommon in the home tomato samples that we've received. So in most cases, you see this kind of distortion. And
Mike, we just lost your sound. For
okay,
some reason, just for the past maybe 5-6 seconds. You were talking about distortion, but now you sound like you're back again.
all right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I think what happened was, sorry about that. I think I leaned my arm against the little hand control on this headset here. So yes, distortion. What was the last thing I said about distortion that you heard?
You were saying, I think cucumber mosaic virus could cause that.
Yes.
Okay.
It causes a shoestringy sort of distortion, not really like this, and is extremely uncommon. I think we had one home garden diagnosis on tomato of that in these past 14 years. So when you see distorted leaves, really other than some of Matt's friends there, one of the first things you want to think about is going to be herbicide. And here's another example of this. This here was one of the few cases where we know the actual culprit because it was from the greenhouse, or maybe that was this next one here. No, this one we did know because it was a plant that Brian Whipker deliberately exposed to 2,4-D. So we know that it was an exposure to a particular compound. So that's the synthetic auxins. On the one hand, you get the distortion. With the other most common herbicide culprit, you see this classic bright yellowing of the bases of the leaflets. And this, of course, is from glyphosate, which is not just found in Roundup anymore, but a lot of different other products. It's off patent, and tomato is very sensitive. So you may have some tomatoes that were just exposed by drift, let's say. And I've even heard a case or two where glyphosate was used to clear away the weeds in a vegetable garden, and then someone came back and transplanted too soon and got damaged that way. A couple of cases here, Alamance and Edgecombe counties. But again, this is one you can definitely diagnose yourself because of the very classic symptoms. Just a quick mention of this problem with the herbicide carryover in hay or manure. These are some of the synthetic auxin type herbicides that are, a few of them that are really resistant to breakdown and will actually survive, if you want to call it that, in the hay or manure and end up in your garden that way. So there is a fact sheet here on our NC State Extension website that you can use to look up more information, and how, if you suspect that, to do a little bioassay to see if that's might be what's going on. Moving on to number 4 on our list was Septoria leaf spot. So this is a fungal disease, and again, typical of it is that it's on the lower leaves and works its way up the plant. The one on the left also has some root knot nematodes on it, but you can see how it's the lower leaves that were affected most. And on the right, you can see the small leaf spots and can get some kind of tan centers in them there. And if you were waited till they developed and looked at it with the hand lens, you might even see some of the little tiny black specks of the fruiting bodies developing there where the spores are produced and splashed to other leaves up the plant. This fungus will overwinter on plant debris. So this is one of the ones where you want to keep the garden cleaned up well at the end of the year and not have any leaves and vines hanging onto your tomato cages and stakes that you will use again next year. Also, fungicides are an option in this case, but I'm going to talk in general terms about some of the things that we can do to manage these diseases as a whole. Number 5, surprisingly, at least to me, was Fusarium wilt. So this is a fungus as well, but it's one that's in the soil. I'm giving the full name here just because it's an interesting situation where we have not just well, here Fusarium is the genus, Oxysporum is what we call the specific epithet. So together, Fusarium oxysporum is the species, but there are a lot of these that affect and are specific to particular plant hosts. So this one is specific to tomato, so it's called Forma specialis lycopersicii. And there's a photograph there from a garden that I don't know if it was this exact plant, but one from this garden that Matt submitted a number of years ago now, and that turned out to have Fusarium wilt. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the things that you might look for here would be one-sided wilting. Obviously, not so much anymore with the plant on the left, but in the photograph there on the right, you can see how one side of in fact, here is on the stem. You can see one side here. You see the leaves are yellowing, and the other side they're still green. So that has to do with which part of the vascular system is affected at this point by the fungus. Now, let me ask a quick question. See if I can navigate over to the chat box here and look for the answers if they do come in. So let me see here. All right, I am ready. Do the letters VFN mean anything to anyone? VFN. We don't see them anymore. At least I haven't for a long time, but I want to ask if anyone remembers what that is. All right, Ruth, you say yes. What do those letters represent to you? Ah, that's cheating. You Googled it. Okay. Yes, VFN were the letters that were used to designate tomato cultivars that were resistant to 3 things. So V for verticillium wilt, F for Fusarium wilt, N for root knot nematodes. And if it just had, one of the 2 of the letters, then that represented it just had resistance to 1 or 2 of those particular problems. So I'm going to close my chat now, so I'm oblivious for the moment of if anybody else is going to use that, but we'll go back to that in a little bit. So yeah, VFN was how these were designated, and it's important to keep in mind some differences in terminology that may be out there. So talking or emailing with Charlotte, I agreed to mention this point briefly. So in terms of how plants do in response to certain pathogens or disease-causing microorganisms, we have 2 different terms: resistance and tolerance. And resistance, properly speaking, is when the host plant is able to restrict the growth and development of the pathogen. It could be at the initial infection stages, it could be in even to the late stages of its reproduction, but somehow that plant is genetically able to restrict the growth and development of the pathogen itself. Whereas tolerance means that plant is performing, usually yielding, at least adequately, in spite of the fact that the pathogen is present and developing. So you could have a situation where a plant is tolerant, but the pathogen is actually building up to higher levels than it was before. But the plant is able to withstand that. We also use the term tolerance, of course, when we're talking about abiotic stressors like salt tolerance and so forth, drought tolerance. Now, here's the wrinkle. You may have a plant that is resistant to a certain pathogen, but strains of the pathogen can be selected for, can occur and then be selected for because you've got the host resistance, and then those strains can overcome certain sets of resistance genes that are used in the host. And these strains are called races, and they're given numbers. In the case of Fusarium wilt, there are 3, races 1, 2, and 3. There may be a race 0 as well. Have to check that. But the ones at least that have some kind of capability of overcoming resistance genes are 1, 2, and 3. So you may have a tomato that is resistant to Fusarium race 1 and 2, but not to race 3. And that's been a problem lately is the race 3. Although I'd have to look and see, I don't know that we've got, since it's it's an elaborate test where you have to inoculate different hosts. I don't know if there's molecular methods now to determine what race it is. We don't usually go to that step. And so I can't tell you how prevalent it is, at least race 3 in the garden situation, but it has been an issue in the greenhouse industry. Basically, you have a tomato that's supposed to be resistant to races 1 and 2, and it still gets Fusarium wilt, then you just conclude that it was race 3. And again, Charlotte is going to be talking a little bit about what we can do as far as choosing plants that are resistant. Now, no one mentioned, and it wasn't on the list, but often people think about verticillium wilt. Often people think about it in maples. And I like to say that verticillium wilt has the best public relations firm in the whole of plant pathology. So a lot of people think about verticillium wilt. It is relatively rare, though, in North Carolina, whether it be in trees or in other plants. And so I would have to double check, but I don't think, no, I remember now. We've only had in the last 14 years, since we've got this current database going, 1 case of verticillium wilt in tomato, and it was in a production setting. It was not in a home garden. If you were to see it, it would be in the mountains, because this, or these particular fungi, there are 2 species, are not tolerant of heat. So you would not likely see this, but I just toss that out there because many people have heard of it. In tomato, you would not get as much vascular discoloration with this as you would with, say, the Fusarium wilt or the southern bacterial wilt. Moving along to the list after the top 5, and I'm omitting one here called undetermined injury. That would be and similar to the ones at the top here. So Pythium diseases, and then potato aphid. So Matt mentioned that. That turned out actually the most common arthropod diagnosis on tomatoes. Again, they're not particularly damaging, but there they are as showing up as common. Although, if you call, approximately once a year on average common. Early blight, I think someone mentioned that in their list of things that were on their top 5. Not all that common, as it turns out. Now that one has both a leaf spot and the capability of causing stem lesions, like you see here. Bacterial spot, see on the right, and that is one of the reasons why you really want to be careful about your transplants, because that thing can really take off in the greenhouse, and then you end up buying transplants that are infected. Southern stem blight, shown in the photo here on the left. Again, the development of the mycelium there, and you can just barely see some of these sclerotia starting to develop here on the stem as well. High soluble salts and root knot nematode would be the one pictured on the right. On tomato, it does tend to form rather large galls, so fairly easy to see. I believe someone mentioned late blight in their list, and as it turns out, you notice it wasn't even on the top 10 there. As it turns out, it is not common on the homeowner tomatoes. The reason, though, it's important is because if it, well, not only is it a damaging disease, but we're worried about it being on commercial sites nearby. So in this case, also because other Phytophthora species can cause similar damage, you definitely want to submit a sample if you suspect late blight on tomatoes, so that can be confirmed and then reported to the what's it called? USA Blight website, if that's what it's still called, for keeping track of these things nationwide. I threw in an extra slide here to mention tomato yellow leaf curl virus. So Matt, I'm gonna give them a little quiz to see if they remember. I'll navigate back to the chat here. What was the vector that transmits tomato yellow leaf curl virus? See if anyone recalls. Nope, thrips were tomato spotted wilt, so they're extremely important. Aphids, that was the potyviruses, which we don't really see in tomatoes as far as I know here. Yes, so the white flies are correct, the three who are indicating that. So yes, this is transmitted by white flies. And we have only had one confirmed home landscape detection of this in the period that I'm talking about. But what's scary about this is that we have had already this year 3 confirmed cases in greenhouses. So if you've got something that's starting out in the transplants and then going into the garden, then you've got a concern. I mean, oops, sorry, I didn't reveal the white flies there. So another reason to want to make sure that you're getting and using clean transplants, although again, it has not so far been at least a confirmed widespread issue in tomatoes in the garden here in North Carolina. So that rounding out sort of the top ones on the list, but there were a few other things that are recognizable and I wanted to mention as well. So here, and I still have the chat open, what 2 different problems do you see in this photograph? And I'll give you a hint, neither one are diseases. And they're not arthropods either. Okay. Yes, Charlotte. Okay, so nutrition was good. It was general. Charlotte hit it on the head there. So what we've got here is a combination of magnesium deficiency, which typically you recognize by this chlorosis or yellowing between the veins of the lower leaves, and also a physiological leaf roll. Very good. And here, everyone knows what this is and was mentioned at the top when we talked about what is your list of major problems. But blossom end rot caused by a calcium deficiency in the developing fruit. But the question is, what is your recommendation going to be in these cases? And I'm just going to jump to the Master Gardener or the Extension Gardener Handbook, Chapter 16, and what it says. So applying preventive sprays of calcium chloride to the tomatoes is not very effective. To prevent the problem in the future, maintain an even moisture level by regular watering and using good mulch. Plant in well-drained soil and avoid using high nitrogen fertilizers. Do not cultivate deeply close to the plant. Test soil and use lime as recommended to bring the pH up to 6.5 to 6.8. So you've got a combination of the 2 things here. You want to make sure your soil has enough calcium in it, and you also want to make sure that the moisture is even enough so that you don't have problems with the plant being unable to take that calcium up and move it into the developing fruit. So when I mentioned this a few years ago, but there was someone who had told me that they were able to take care of their blossom end rot by putting crushed eggshells around the plants. And I actually had put that question to Chris Gunter, and here was his response. I think putting eggshells in the soil will raise calcium in that small local zone, but it will take a very long time and be a very limited concentration, which will likely be too low to make a difference in a single season. And he emphasized that the blossom end rot is usually a question of uptake rather than supply, which depends on the transpiration stream. So again, not letting the plants dry down. And my experience and many others is that those first clusters of tomatoes that come on the plants for some reason tend to have more blossom end rot, so they're not necessarily an indication of what you will see later in the crop. All right. I'm not going to really talk about this problem, but it's one that you may see. These are radial growth cracks, but there also are some sort of circumferential type growth cracks. These can happen when things like the development of the fruit is faster and slower depending on weather conditions and so forth. And I just will refer you to the link here. I'll try and drop that in the chat when Charlotte is talking for a blog that Emma did several years ago about growth cracks in tomatoes. And then I want to leave off with, before I talk about a few just management recommendations in general, the idea that these different diseases have a sort of a seasonality. So the bar represents the period of time when you might expect to see it, with the most intense coloration being when you'd most likely see it. So right now, June, July, August, these are the hot times for most of our tomato diseases. Interestingly, though, the chemical injury, the tomato spotted wilt, those are going to be kind of in the rear view mirror by the time we get about a month from now. Not that you couldn't have it, but that it's going to be less likely. The asterisks on each bar, by the way, are the dates of the first home garden find in our records for that period of time. So far, fortunately, we do not have late blight reported in tomato in the state of North Carolina, and there's going to be an announcement anytime that happens. Each year, there's an announcement about that on the extension portal, so that's something you can also be looking for. Very quickly, some of the things you can do to manage and prevent tomato diseases in the home garden, and I've touched on some of these already, but for the soil-borne diseases and the ones that can survive in debris, you want to make sure you're on a crop rotation, minimum of 3 years, and the effectiveness of that will be variable. So I'm really skeptical about that working for example, southern bacterial wilt. That bacterium just survives so well in the soil. And of course, if you've got any kind of weeds, especially solanaceous weeds, then you may be, your rotation is not going to be as effective. But a good general recommendation, crop rotation, minimum of 3 years. Proper liming and fertilization, as we talked about, using resistant cultivars when they're available. Charlotte, again, will be giving us that lowdown, starting with clean transplants or clean seeds, using grafted transplants against certain soil-borne diseases, and I'll show a picture of that in a moment, minimizing leaf wetness, so don't especially prolong the overnight leaf wetness period if for some reason they have to be watered in such a way that the foliage is wet. And removing the older infected leaves, that can be a strategy when you've got septoria leaf spot or early blight that might be working its way from the bottom up. And fungicides may be good also for the case of septoria, possibly for early blight. With bacterial spot, if the weather's not conducive, you could try to use some copper-based products, but if the weather is really conducive, once it's present, it's gonna take off and you're gonna have a hard time stopping it. Let me show this. I see some questions coming in the chat, but I just want to give you quickly the page number here, page 287 of the Southeast U.S. Vegetable Crop Handbook, a table of different management strategies and their effectiveness, relative effectiveness against different tomato diseases. And I'm pretty sure that this link is going to go in the email that'll go out after the program so that you can look that one up. And a quick picture of the effectiveness of some of these grafted tomatoes against bacterial wilt, pictures that Frank Lowe's gave me, and you can see the grafted ones there, lush and green, and the not grafted ones completely wiped out. All right, to your questions then in the chat box.
Mike, I think I would just ask, in the interest of time, if you would take a look at the chat and answer those to the best of your ability. We could move on with Charlotte. Lot to cover with tomatoes, of course. How does that sound?
I will attempt to do that.
There are not too many, so thank you. And Charlotte, we will turn it over to you. We're going to do the Plants These Instead feature now because it links so nicely to the tomato presentation. So once you're set up, we'll get going.
Thank you. Yes, let me get my screen share up. Okay. All right. So thank you, Matt and Mike. That was excellent. Of all the amazing stuff you shared and things about tomatoes, the one thing I can't get out of my mind is the idea of plant diseases having agents representing them and getting their names out there. So I think there's a comedy series in that. We need to work on it. But I'm going to talk about, really, I think our Plant These Instead this month should be Plant These as well. Because we're not saying only plant these tomato varieties, but we're saying add these to your mix to increase your chances of success. Still plant your favorites, plant heirlooms, plant a variety of tomato varieties. And that's going to give you the greatest chance of success. So we're going to focus on disease-resistant varieties. And of course, something that can be resistant to disease is not the same as being immune to disease. So in most cases, these plants are going to perform well even when the disease is present. But what we see over time, actually, sometimes is these resistant varieties, that resistance can break down as the diseases adapt to the mechanisms of resistance. So that's one reason why if you start looking at some older publications, you'll see other varieties listed. There's always new varieties coming out, and one of those reasons, one of many reasons, is just to kind of keep up with having that resistance for our diseases. So unfortunately, no tomato variety is resistant to all or even most of these tomato diseases. We're going to focus in on some of the most serious problems, the tomato spotted wilt virus, and then some of the soil-borne diseases. And also, unfortunately, the heirloom varieties have little to no resistance unless they've been grafted on resistant rootstock, which we'll mention a little bit as well. I dropped a link in the chat to the Plant These Instead slide archive. And you can see these slides there and all the links. There's going to be a lot of things linked throughout these slides. They're all there in the archive, so you can go and click on them and learn more about various topics. But before we jump to our next slide, I wanted to mention, so over here on the right, we have like a typical listing you might find in a good seed catalog. As Mike mentioned, you used to always see these resistance codes on tomato labels and in catalogs. And I think, in an effort to make things more simple, a lot of companies maybe have stopped listing this type of specific codes, and they just say disease resistant. So there are some catalogs, definitely some companies that still are more specific. And so I would try to track that information down. I actually mentioned a few on the slide and a few slides on. So the information's out there, but sometimes you have to look for it a little harder than you used to. So this looks like, some other language. What's going on with all these different codes listed for this Big Beef Plus variety? Well, they're referring to the types of diseases that that specific variety has some resistance to. So this is not all. There are probably a few others out there. There's some more virus diseases, and it is going to vary some from catalog or website that you visit. Exactly the specific, sometimes the specific letters might vary, and sometimes just the number, variety of diseases they list these resistance codes for. But these are some of the most common. I spent some time going through various seed catalogs and looking at what was out there. And I found this is probably a little more extensive than you find in most catalogs, but this catches a lot of the issues that have already actually been mentioned today and that we commonly run into. So what we're going to focus on today is this TSWV, tomato spotted wilt virus. That is a serious problem we've talked about that's spread by thrips. There's not really anything you can do using pesticide wise to control it in a home garden anyway. And it pretty much is always fatal to tomatoes. So we're going to focus on varieties that are resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus. And we're going to mention these soil-borne diseases and what to look for. We just want to specify with those, really be familiar with these codes. We talked about verticillium's actually not that common, but fusarium wilt we see, and there are those 3 races Mike mentioned. And Mike, what I read, because I was a little confused too about, is there 4 races, 0, 1, 2, and 3? And I read somewhere, I can't remember exactly which site I was looking at, is that in the United States, we refer to races 1, 2, and 3, but in Europe, they call them races 0, 1, and 2. So that makes things nice and confusing
Oh,
to
wow.
use,
Yeah.
to use different numberings, but there seem to be only 3. So fusarium wilt, there can be the 3. And so a lot of catalogs will designate that by the number of Fs. So if it's just 1 F, it's race 1, 2 Fs, it's 1 and 2, and the 3 Fs would be race 1, 2, and 3. Then the root knot nematode is another one that's fairly common in home gardens. So we're going to look at some of these. Starting with tomato spotted wilt virus. I know Inga Meadows posted, I don't know if it was officially a pest alert, but she posted within the last few weeks that they were seeing a lot of tomato spotted wilt virus, particularly in the central and western part of the state this year. I know it's always pretty common in the eastern part of the state, but maybe in some years not quite so common the further west you move across our state. So it's always good to include at least one variety of tomato that's resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus. The challenge is finding them. There's really only one that's pretty widely available. That's because one of the big commercial growers that supplies the big box stores grows it, and that's Amelia. So I was able to get Amelia this spring, and it's pretty much been out there for several years now, pretty reliably available from like your Lowe's and Home Depot and places like that, because it is grown by Bonnie Plants, and that's one of their major suppliers. There may also be local growers who are growing their own plants from seed that may grow this one, plus some of these others that we're going to list. But that's the one, as far as this spring, that I found generally available in the marketplace for home gardeners. But there are lots of seeds available. So if you are interested in growing your own plants from seed, there are seed companies that specialize in tomato varieties that offer quite a few of these. And one of the newer introductions is what is this Plus series of tomatoes, and they're especially marketed to home gardeners. So they've given them the names of some of the classic popular tomato varieties. There's Better Boy Plus, Big Boy, Big Beef Plus, Celebrity Plus, and Lemon Boy Plus. So you want to make sure the plus is there. The plus indicates it's got the tomato spotted wilt virus resistance. So, if you just buy regular Better Boy seed or regular Celebrity seed or plants, you're not going to get the resistance. You've got to have the plus. And the reason, one thing that really kind of shows these are marketed to home gardeners, not only the fact that the names they're using, but they're indeterminate varieties. So one thing you'll almost often see listed with tomatoes is, are they determinate or indeterminate? Which means, do they grow, kind of set all their fruit in a pretty short time and then they're done? That would be determinate. Or do they keep growing all season, getting taller and taller and setting more and more fruit? And those are indeterminate. So home gardeners prefer that indeterminate habit because they fruit over a longer time, where commercial growers like the determinate habit. They get to a certain size, set most of their crop, you go in and harvest, you're done. So these are almost all of these are indeterminate except for the Celebrity Plus, and Celebrity itself is a determinate variety. So those are some that you will find. There are definitely others out there that these are more bred specifically for commercial production, so they're all determinants. NC State has done a lot of tomato breeding. They have a mountain series, several of which have tomato spotted wilt virus. Not all of them do, but quite a few do. So the Mountain Merit, which we see in the picture here, has that tomato spotted wilt virus, as well as late blight resistance, the 3 fusariums, verticillium, and nematode. So it's got a lot of resistance there. Mountain Gem and Mountain Majesty, those are also round red tomatoes. They also have a couple of grape tomato varieties in the Mountain series that have tomato spotted wilt virus resistance, Mountain Honey and Mountain Vineyard. There are other ones out there. I've listed the ones that I found in seed catalogs. So there's more than what's actually listed here, but I was looking in seed catalogs that home gardeners typically would order from and found things like Bella Rosa and Galahad and Health Kick. So those are some that you can find in the market to order. And I've also listed some references here to learn more about tomato spotted wilt virus and see different pictures of what it looks like, which when you go to the slide archive, you can click on those links. And here's where I mentioned that I have included the name of, these are the seed companies that I was looking at in their catalogs and the varieties they list, just to double check and make sure they're available on the market for gardeners. Of course, when we do list seed companies or any types of products, it's as a convenience and it is not an endorsement for the companies that are listed or any discrimination against companies that aren't listed. But these are companies that if you check their catalogs or go to their websites, you can find the varieties that we've just been mentioning. They may also actually, quite a few, I think all of them also offer grafted plants where you can actually order grafted plants. That's what we're going to talk about next. Or you can buy the seed for tomato rootstock if you want to try to graft your own. So let's look at that a little bit. And that's the grafted plants really becomes a bigger thing when we start talking about these soil-borne diseases. But first, luckily, for quite a few of our soil-borne problems, we do have resistant varieties. And those would be, specifically for fusarium, which we've seen is occurring across North Carolina, although verticillium is not that common, except for maybe in the West. And then for root knot nematodes, so we have fact sheets for those, which are linked here that you can go and learn more about from the slide archive, and will also be part of the follow-up email. So these, I would say there's a lot of varieties out there with these resistances, and you just need to find the catalog or some reference that'll tell you so that you know which varieties to look for. And especially if you have a site that has a history of one of these problems. So if you have a site and you have root knot nematodes, very important, not only to rotate your crops, don't grow host plants there every year, but also when you do grow like a tomato there, make sure it is root knot nematode resistant. And same for fusarium and the other things listed here. So and here we have the picture of root knot nematode over here on the side. Not something you want to see when you pull your tomatoes up at the end of the season. But unfortunately, there is no resistant varieties available for bacterial wilt or southern blight. So we're going to look at those two a little bit. So with bacterial wilt, we do have an option in that we do have these rootstocks which are like strains of tomato relatives, or kind of very wild tomatoes that you wouldn't want to eat their fruit, pretty much inedible as far as if you just grew them on their own, but they're super tough and resilient, and they have resistance to specific diseases. So what you can do is you can grow the rootstock seedlings, and you grow your scion seedlings, the variety that you want to have the fruit of. And when they're still quite small, like you see in this picture, you snip them. You snip both of them in half and stick them together. Your rootstock on the bottom, your scion on the top. There are special little clips, as you see here, that hold that graft union in place and let it heal and let it bond those two plants together. And so then you get a plant that has a very resilient root system that is resistant to the specific disease problems, and you have the top that's going to bear the fruit that you want. You can do this yourself. It is, it's quite an undertaking, but we're Master Gardener volunteers, right? And in fact, the Extension Master Gardener volunteers in Durham County had a huge project just a few years ago on grafting tomatoes, and there's a link here where you can learn more about that. So they have got some great resources they put together based on their experience. As I mentioned before, there are also quite a few companies that sell these plants. You can order them online, usually earlier in the season. Most of them are sold out by now. And there's some commercial growers out there actually that will sell to groups, say if you wanted to hold a plant sale and feature some of these plants. And that's exactly what the Master Gardener volunteers in Chatham County have done the last few years. And we've got a link here about their spring plant sale this past spring that featured these heirloom tomatoes that were grafted. They were grafted specifically on this Xinjiang. I don't know if that's correct pronunciation, but that is the rootstock they were grafted on. So the important thing to know when you are choosing a rootstock is not every rootstock is resistant to bacterial wilt. I've got a table linked here that will give you all of the different commercial rootstocks that are out there and the specific issues that they are resistant to. And it's going to take some, you might have to really blow it up or put some super magnification on it because it's a pretty extensive table and very small, very small writing if you just try to print it on 8.5 by 11. But the rootstocks that are commercially available that are specifically resistant to bacterial wilt, there's one named Armada, and that's pretty much the only resistance it has. So there's some other ones that have multiple resistances. These 4 have the resistance to these diseases listed here: Fusarium, Verticillium, and root knot nematode. So you get more than just the bacterial wilt resistance. So that is, your option for bacterial wilt. You can't grow just one variety itself. It has to be one of these grafted varieties. And then unfortunately for southern blight, there's not even a grafting option. This is the issue Mike mentioned, that you get when in the advanced stage of disease development, you get this white mycelium growth, and then you get those little almost mustard seed or not quite as big as osmocote pellets, but these little tan kind of pellets forming in that white mycelium. And I think probably one reason not a lot of those, I think this is, in my experience, this has been pretty common, especially in the eastern and middle part of the state, but it's so distinct, it's easy to diagnose at the extension office. So these aren't making it to the plant clinic, like things like the stuff that's a little more obscure to diagnose. So not only are there no resistant varieties, but there are hundreds of host plants for southern blight. So it's really hard to try to avoid growing something that's, not going to be affected by this disease. So crop rotation's not so much of a strategy here. But you can, if you have the space, you can grow in a different site. Just really be careful not to contaminate any other site with soil from the infested site. You can grow in large containers filled with soilless media, or you can grow in straw bales. And there's a link here to a fact sheet. I've done this with tomatoes, and they actually grow really well in straw bales if you prepare them correctly and manage the moisture. So that would be your option for southern blight. So just to finish up, you can go to the plant toolbox and learn a lot more about tomato cultivation varieties, and there's quite a few links built in there to disease fact sheets and more. A tip for finding tomatoes, quickly finding tomatoes in the plant toolbox is search for tomatoes. The plural, if you just put tomato in, you're not going to get quite as quickly to the fact sheet. So search for tomatoes. And of course, as I've mentioned, the archive link is here, and all of the linked items within the archive are there for you to click on and learn more. So I am going to turn it back over to Matt and Mike for bolos, because I know we're running a little bit late today, but this is a really big topic with tomato diseases and issues, and I'll take a look in the chat to see if there are any questions. Oh, and I do see that Ashley does say that that Xinjiang was one of the rootstocks they tried, and it did have a tasty fruit. So very interesting. Good.
All right, Mike, I guess I'll go first. Just we went in that order too. So very quickly, we'll go over some arthropod bolos for July. Oh, and thanks, Charlotte, for presenting on those resistant varieties. That's really great. Okay, so cicadas. We're gonna start hearing a lot of noisy insects out there. These large insects will emerge from the ground. The annual cicadas this year at this time of year, sometimes called the dog day cicadas because of this time of year. So it's going to start to get noisier, and because of that, we're also going to start seeing and have already seen cicada killers. These large wasps should not be confused for giant hornets or killer hornets or anything like that. They are a hunting wasp. They are harmless to humans. The males may be staking out territories right now and may fly around you and buzz you, but they can't actually harm you. They won't sting you, and the females are not interested in you at all. They are interested in hunting cicadas to bury for their young. We're also going to see full-grown wheel bugs soon. These very large assassin bugs are very conspicuous, and just be careful not to hold them or mess with them because they can deliver a painful jab. But otherwise, they're generalist predators that can be important in gardens and other places. We're already seeing fall webworms start to make their silk tents on the tips of trees all over. They prefer a lot of different species of plants, and you often see them along roadsides and basically everywhere. You're going to start to see them soon. These generally don't harm plants very much, even though they do defoliate and make them look bad. The plants typically survive fine, even in high infestations. But if you want to do your part, you can rip open the webs with a pole trimmer or something like that. You can also apply some pesticides if you catch them early on near the leaves where they'll be feeding when they come out of their webs. We talked about a few caterpillars today feeding on tomatoes, but there's lots of other crops that we're growing on our vegetable gardens. So you're going to start to see more garden caterpillars. This is a cross-striped cabbage worm, feeds on brassicans, and here's a squash vine borer. The squash vine borer adults have been out, probably laying eggs. So if you have squash and it's starting to look bad, you may investigate the base for the frass and holes and things like that from the squash vine borers. June beetles are going to be out. This is the time of year where we tend to see them the most. These are a green and bronze metallic beetle. They're very fast flying beetles because they're one of the few beetles that can close its wing coverings when it's flying. That makes them very aerodynamic. So when they're flying around, they often seem like a big wasp or something like that, but in fact, it is a beetle. They're only really a nuisance, although they can break into fruit that's ripe. So ripening fruit on trees and bushes like blackberries, peaches, other soft fruit, they can actually bore in, stick their head in and feed on that fruit. And so sometimes they're also called, fig beetles, because figs are also a very soft fruit sometimes. And of course, everything else is just getting bigger. Everything's active. It's warm. You guys start to notice the garden spiders. They've been there all year, but they've been very small up until this point. And so you may start seeing bigger critters around your home and in your garden, but know that not all are pests, and many are beneficial or just out there enjoying the summer. And I will turn it over to Mike then.
Thank you, Matt. Let's see here. I am going to make the briefest bolo in the history of disease bolos on this program. And start that now. All right. So again, I'd like to remind folks that if you want the full list of the Be on the Lookouts month by month, they're on our website. Go to the main page there, pdic.ces.ncsu.edu, and look on the menu bar on the left-hand side, and you'll notice the link that says bolos. So I'm just going to present two of these, one slide, and they are that to be on the lookout for cucurbit downy mildew, which was confirmed as of June 1st of this year. It doesn't overwinter in North Carolina, but it will come up from other places where it does. And so it's always a question of when is it going to arrive? And there are actually two different what are called clades or genetic groups, one that tends more on cucumber. And let's see, looking at the information here from Lena's lab. So as clade 2 isolates have a host preference for cucumbers and cantaloupes, and clade 1 isolates have a preference to infect squash, pumpkin, and watermelon. So there's a little bit of differentiation there. So on any of your cucurbits, though, be on the lookout for downy mildew. Those start out, especially with a cucumber, you'll have a nice bright yellow angular leaf spot that then dies. The spots aren't quite as well defined on, let's say, on cantaloupe, for example. And the other bolo to mention is the Phytophthora blight of annual vinca, which can be an aerial blight or it can be a root and stem rot. And these particular pictures, very nice flower color here. This was a variety that I tried for the first time this year, and the website of the seed company said that it was immune to the dreaded Phytophthora. Well, this was a bed here that is infested with Phytophthora, known to be, and those plants ended up succumbing, most of them very quickly, although the one you see in the top of the picture there is has grown and is doing well, but it's a little bit higher there. It's got a little bit drier. Now, if we start getting more rains, that one may fall apart too. But for one thing, we want to avoid the term immune, and the other is that because these are, for example, Phytophthora, they're different species, there are different races in some cases, and I believe that there are. So you can't exactly know if a statement about resistance is going to apply in every situation. And with that, I will turn it back over.
All right, thanks, Mike and Matt. I will finish off with just a few announcements to close us out today. Okay, back to sharing my screen. So we do have the online class, the online plant ID class. The session that's being offered this summer is trees, shrubs, and conifers, and all of them will be offered this fall. So if you're interested in learning more about plant ID and learning more about great plants for our landscapes, strongly encourage you to take some of the online plant ID courses that are offered through NC State Extension and Longwood Gardens. There is a considerable discount for Master Gardener volunteers. These are for the hybrid course, the online courses that are instructor-led. But they are also now available as self-study courses you can take anytime. So if you'd rather just do it on your own timetable, check out the self-study courses, which you can find more information about all of these at the link listed here, or the barcode, or not the barcode, QR code. So check those out. Also, I hope you're saving the date, holding on your calendar October 27th through the 29th. That will be the Extension Master Gardener College, which will be held at Hunt Library on Centennial Campus. And our focus will be gardening in a changing climate. So we'll be talking about the impact of climate change on plant growth and gardens, and strategies you can use to garden successfully in a changing climate, and resources that you can take back and use it for educational programming in your community. We'll have a lot more information by our July Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. So look for that to be coming out soon, as well as registration opening later in July or early August. Of course, the J.C. Ralston Arboretum continues their excellent series of online events throughout the month. So we encourage you to visit their website and go to the events and calendar to find out about things they have coming up, both in person or online. And we mentioned this last month, but wanted to mention it again, the Garden Help Directory. This is a website that is open to the public, so they can go and find out, I'm in this county, who do I contact? It includes contact information. If there's direct contact information for Master Gardener volunteers, say a plant clinic or hotline, that's there. You know, if it's just contact the Extension office, that's there. And the one thing we're trying to add are more websites, particularly if you have a Facebook page for Extension Master Gardener program in your county, or you have another website you would like listed other than the as well as the Extension website. The Extension websites are listed for all our county centers. So if you have that information, we encourage you to email us at ncemgprogram@ncsu.edu and share that so we can add it to the site. Looking ahead, next month we'll have a guest speaker. We're looking at stormwater solutions, but wanted to call out August 23rd and to take your pictures. And I saw Matt, there was a question in the chat about some strange growth on tomato stems, and great suggestion from Matt to get some pictures and submit them for the August webinar. So encourage everybody, as you see things going on in your garden in the next month or two, get some pictures so that we can look at them for August, and hopefully Matt and Mike will be able to identify them and just share their knowledge and wisdom. Then on September 27th, we will actually look at climate change mitigation for gardeners and homeowners, and we'll finish up the season in October, which we have moved up the date a little bit because of the EMG College, and that'll finish things out with current pest and disease issues. All right, so I know we've run over just a little bit today, but such a big topic, such a really popular topic of tomatoes and their diseases and issues. So appreciate everybody for staying with us. And we look forward to seeing you next month when we have Mitch Woodward, who is an area specialized agent for water quality with North Carolina Cooperative Extension, and he will be talking about small scale stormwater solutions for your landscape. Thank you all.
Have a good month, everyone.